Like the video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications. Because stories like this are not told often, and when they are, they deserve to be heard fully. There was always something magnetic about Tony Curtis, something that pulled people toward him before he ever spoke a line or smiled for the camera. On screen, he embodied confidence, charm, and ease, a man who looked as though life had opened every door without resistance. Audiences believed he lived a golden life, protected by fame and applause, untouched by darkness. Yet that image was only half the truth. Behind the polished exterior was a man shaped by wounds that began long before Hollywood ever knew his name. Tony Curtis did not grow up dreaming of stardom and comfort. He grew up learning how to endure. His life was not a smooth ascent, but a constant struggle between reinvention and survival. Fame did not erase his past, it merely buried it under bright lights. And the deeper his career went, the more those buried truths pressed against the surface. The world embraced him as an icon, but few understood the private storms he carried quietly for decades. When those truths finally emerged, some during his life, others after his death, they revealed a version of Tony Curtis that no audience had been prepared to see. A man who was not only a star, but also a survivor of poverty, loss, addiction, and emotional abandonment, shaped by pain he never truly escaped. Tony Curtis began life not as a Hollywood fantasy, but as Bernard Schwartz, born in 1925 to Hungarian Jewish immigrants in New York City. His childhood unfolded in the shadow of poverty, cramped spaces, and constant instability. His parents struggled to survive, working tirelessly while barely scraping together enough to feed their children. English was not the language spoken at home, and young Bernard often felt like an outsider even in his own neighborhood. By the age of 8, circumstances became so desperate that Bernard and his younger brother Julius were sent to an orphanage. It was not an act of cruelty, but one of survival. Still, the emotional impact was devastating. To a child, separation feels like abandonment, no matter the reason. That experience carved a deep wound into Bernard's sense of security and belonging. When he eventually returned home, the world did not soften. Tragedy struck again when Julius, his closest companion and emotional anchor, was killed in a traffic accident at just 12 years old. Bernard was only a boy, yet he was forced to process grief that most adults struggle to survive. Loss became a defining force in his life, teaching him early that love could vanish without warning. Home, which should have offered comfort after such trauma, was anything but safe. Tony's mother suffered from severe mental illness, later diagnosed as schizophrenia. Her behavior could be loving one moment and frightening the next, creating an environment of unpredictability and fear. Violence, emotional instability, and silence became part of daily life. Years later, Tony's surviving brother Robert would also develop schizophrenia and be institutionalized, reinforcing the sense that mental illness haunted his family relentlessly. There was no stability to lean on, no emotional refuge. Survival depended on emotional walls, learning when to speak and when to disappear. For a child, this kind of environment does not simply fade with time. It shapes the nervous system, the heart, the way trust is formed or never formed at all. Feeling lost, angry, and invisible, Tony drifted toward a street gang as a teenager. The crimes were small, truancy, petty theft, but they reflected a deeper hunger for belonging and control. He was not searching for trouble. He was searching for identity. And then, unexpectedly, one small intervention changed everything. A neighbor who saw potential rather than delinquency sent him to a Boy Scout camp, unknowingly redirecting the course of his life. That time away from chaos introduced Tony to structure, discipline, and a version of himself he had never been allowed to imagine. In the quiet of camp life, he discovered that he could follow rules, lead others, and feel pride without fear. Something shifted inside him. When he returned to school, his anger softened into focus. At 16, he stepped onto a stage for the first time, shaving his head bald for a role he treated with an intensity that surprised everyone. Acting was not just performance for him, it was escape. It offered a way out of the life he had been born into and a chance to become someone else entirely. That spark of purpose became an obsession. He clung to it with determination fueled by fear of returning to poverty and invisibility. When World War II erupted, Bernard Schwartz enlisted in the U.S. Navy. He served aboard a submarine in the Pacific and witnessed Japan's formal surrender in Tokyo Bay. The experience hardened him, but also expanded his sense of possibility. When he returned home, he knew survival was no longer enough. He wanted a life bigger than anything he had known. Acting became his singular dream, fragile yet powerful enough to pull him across the country to Hollywood with nothing but hope. Hollywood did not welcome Bernard Schwartz with open arms. He arrived in 1948 with $20, one suitcase, and crushing self-doubt. Studio executives saw his name as a problem, too ethnic, too foreign, too real. Universal Pictures offered him a contract, but only if he erased his identity. Bernard Schwartz became Tony Curtis overnight, a name crafted for fantasy, not truth. The transformation was painful but necessary. Early work barely paid enough to survive. He lived in near-empty apartments, survived on pie and milk, and endured humiliation and dismissal. He later admitted that Hollywood did not exploit his naivete. He handed it over willingly. Fear drove him, fear of failure, fear of being sent back to the Bronx. At one point, he nearly quit entirely, standing in a train station ready to return home. A chance intervention by a studio press agent stopped him. That single moment altered the trajectory of his life. Soon, something strange happened. Despite having few speaking lines, magazines began featuring his face. Fan mail poured in. Then came the premiere where the audience erupted in screams for a man the studio barely valued. Fame arrived suddenly, violently, and without preparation. Once Universal recognized his appeal, Tony Curtis's rise was swift. Films like The Prince Who Was a Thief transformed him into a box office sensation. Audiences adored his looks, energy, and effortless charm. Throughout the 1950s, he starred in hit after hit, building a career most actors only dream of. Yet success did not bring peace. It amplified his insecurities. Fame became both armor and prison. He married Janet Leigh in 1951 against studio pressure, and for a time they embodied Hollywood glamour. But Tony's emotional foundation was fragile. Trauma shaped his relationships, making intimacy feel both essential and threatening. Jealousy, distrust, and distance crept into the marriage. He later admitted he never felt enough. As the cracks widened, addiction entered quietly. Alcohol first, then drugs. Hollywood offered easy access to numbing agents, and Tony had spent his life running from pain. Addiction did not begin as excess, it began as escape. By the time the marriage collapsed in 1962, his inner world was already unraveling. Fame gave him everything he wanted, but it also exposed the emptiness he had never healed. The golden boy image remained intact, but beneath it, a slow self-destruction had begun. The 1960s brought change, both creatively and personally. Hollywood tastes shifted, and Tony struggled to adapt. He chased dramatic roles, desperate to prove depth beyond charm. His performance in The Boston Strangler earned critical praise, showing a darker, more complex side of his talent. But professional validation could not heal personal chaos. His addictions intensified. Cocaine entered his life in the 1970s and quickly took control. His health deteriorated. Marriages failed. Scandals followed. An arrest in London for marijuana possession damaged his reputation, while rumors and allegations accumulated. The once unshakable star now appeared vulnerable and erratic. Worst of all was the pain he carried as a father. In 1994, his son Nicholas died from a heroin overdose at just 23. Tony described it as the one loss he would never recover from. Grief deepened his addiction before he finally sought help. Entering the Betty Ford Center in 1982 marked a rare turning point. Sobriety did not erase the past, but it offered clarity. For the first time, Tony confronted himself without distraction. He turned to painting, channeling decades of suppressed emotion into art that reflected chaos, grief, and survival. Painting became a form of therapy, a space where Tony could express what words never captured. His work gained recognition, displayed in galleries and museums, offering him a new identity beyond acting. Yet tragedy followed him. Health issues worsened. Years of smoking led to chronic lung disease. A severe illness in 2006 left him in a coma and later wheelchair-bound. Still, he continued creating, meeting fans, signing books, refusing to disappear quietly. Then came the decision that fractured his family forever. 6 months before his death, Tony rewrote his will, removing all 6 of his children and leaving his entire estate to his much younger wife, Jill Vandenberg. The decision stunned everyone. When he died in 2010, grief turned quickly into shock and anger. Lawsuits followed. Accusations of manipulation surfaced. His legacy became contested territory. After his death, revelations continued to emerge: affairs, allegations, estate battles, forcing the public to reevaluate the man behind the legend. Tony Curtis spent his life reinventing himself, but he never fully escaped the shadows of his past. His story is not one of simple triumph, but of survival, contradiction, and unresolved pain that followed him to the very end. After Tony Curtis's death, the public narrative around him began to fracture in ways that surprised even longtime fans. During his lifetime, many of his darker choices were softened by charm, time, and nostalgia. Death, however, removed the need for politeness. Interviews, memoirs, and old accounts resurfaced, painting a more complicated and uncomfortable portrait. One of the most talked-about revelations came from Tony himself shortly before he died, when he finally admitted to a long-rumored affair with Marilyn Monroe during the filming of Some Like It Hot. For decades, he had joked about it, denied it, or brushed it aside as Hollywood myth. But in his later years, stripped of image protection and no longer chasing approval, he told the truth. The affair was real, emotional, and deeply painful. According to Curtis, Marilyn became pregnant and later miscarried, an event that haunted both of them. What audiences remembered as one of the greatest comedies in film history was, behind the scenes, filled with tension, vulnerability, and heartbreak. This admission forced fans to reconsider the innocence they had projected onto Hollywood's golden age. It was a reminder that glamour often masked suffering, and laughter on screen did not mean peace off camera. Even more troubling were accusations that surfaced after Tony Curtis could no longer respond to them. Actress Kim Novak alleged that in 1958, at a party hosted at Curtis's Beverly Hills home, her drink had been spiked, leaving her disoriented and unable to remember what happened next. She described waking up naked, confused, and deeply shaken. The accusation, made years later, could never be legally tested, yet its emotional weight was undeniable. For many, it symbolized a broader reckoning with Hollywood's past, a time when powerful men were protected by studios and silence was expected from women. Curtis never publicly addressed the claim, and that silence became part of the controversy. The allegation did not erase his talent, but it complicated his legacy in ways that could not be ignored. Fans struggled to reconcile the charming star they loved with the possibility of such behavior. It forced a painful question: how many truths were hidden behind fame, and how often had charisma been mistaken for character? Tony Curtis became, unwillingly, a symbol of that uncomfortable conversation. While public opinion wrestled with his legacy, Tony Curtis's family was fighting a far more personal battle. The rewriting of his will became one of the most controversial decisions of his life. By explicitly naming each of his children only to exclude them from inheritance, Tony ensured that the pain would be precise and unmistakable. His daughter Jamie Lee Curtis and her siblings were devastated, not only by the loss of money, but by what the decision symbolized. They believed their father had been vulnerable, physically weak, and emotionally isolated when the will was changed. Allegations of undue influence quickly followed, and legal challenges were filed. Jill Vandenberg, Tony's final wife, denied all accusations, insisting that the decision reflected Tony's true wishes. Yet the damage was already done. The family fractured publicly, their grief played out in courtrooms and headlines. For Tony's children, the betrayal felt like a final abandonment, echoing the orphanage trauma that had shaped his own childhood. In trying to control his legacy, Tony may have unknowingly repeated the very wounds he had spent his life running from. The auctioning of Tony Curtis's personal belongings added another layer of heartbreak. Awards, letters, artwork, and deeply personal items were sold to strangers, scattering fragments of his life across the world. To his children, it felt like erasure. To collectors, it was history for sale. The event generated significant money, but at the cost of emotional devastation. What should have been family heirlooms became commodities. This moment forced many to question how legacy is defined. Is it ownership, memory, or meaning? Tony Curtis had spent decades building an image the world admired, yet in death, he lost control over how that image was handled. Ironically, the man who reinvented himself countless times could not protect the story that followed him. His desire for control, born from a childhood of chaos, may have guided decisions that caused irreparable harm. In the end, his estate became not a symbol of success, but a battlefield of unresolved pain, reflecting a life where survival often outweighed connection. Looking back, it becomes clear that Tony Curtis's greatest struggle was never fame, addiction, or even scandal. It was intimacy. Trust did not come easily to a man who learned early that stability could vanish overnight. His many marriages, intense relationships, and emotional distance were not signs of carelessness, but symptoms of deep, unresolved trauma. He wanted love, yet feared dependence. He wanted family, yet struggled to stay present. Even his success carried fear, the belief that it could all be taken away at any moment. Addiction, in this context, was not indulgence but anesthesia. It numbed the constant tension between who he was and who the world demanded him to be. Tony Curtis was always performing, even when the cameras were gone. Sobriety brought awareness, but awareness brought regret. And regret is often harder to live with than denial. His later years showed glimpses of peace through art and reflection, but they were also marked by loneliness and fractured relationships that could not be repaired in time. Tony Curtis's life forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth about success. Achievement does not heal childhood wounds. Fame does not replace safety. Money does not undo grief. From orphanage halls to red carpets, Tony carried the same emotional scars with him, merely disguised by applause. He was both a victim of circumstance and a man responsible for his choices. That duality makes his story powerful and unsettling. It refuses simple judgment. He was capable of kindness and cruelty, brilliance and self-destruction, devotion and abandonment. His talent remains undeniable. His influence on cinema remains secure. Yet his life reminds us that unresolved pain does not disappear with age, it evolves. Hollywood celebrated his charm, but never asked what created it. Perhaps if the industry had understood trauma instead of exploiting charisma, his story might have ended differently. Tony Curtis did not fail because he lacked strength. He failed because he carried too much alone for too long. In the end, Tony Curtis's story is not just a Hollywood tragedy. It is a human one. A boy who survived poverty and loss became a global icon, yet never stopped fighting the shadows of his past. His life challenges us to look beyond surface success and question what truly defines fulfillment. Was his greatest turning point fame, addiction, sobriety, or loss? Or was it the moment he learned to survive instead of dream? That question lingers long after the credits roll. Tony Curtis will be remembered for his films, his charisma, and his cultural impact. But perhaps his most important legacy is the reminder that healing matters as much as achievement. Without it, even legends remain unfinished stories. What do you think was the biggest turning point in Tony Curtis's troubled life? Share your thoughts in the comments, and if you want more untold Hollywood stories, make sure to like, subscribe, and stay tuned for the next one.